Good morning. Welcome to our Sunday morning service. My name is Darren Bovis Coulter. I'm the pastor here at Limerick Wood Baptist Church. And you join us this morning as we start a new series here in Daniel, 4 Kings, 4 Lessons for You. And as we start a new series, this was actually something I was not necessarily expecting to be doing in this format. There was a plan for the whole year with lots of visiting speakers booked in, and there were some large chunks of time that were actually dedicated to longer series of focused teaching. But as we've seen some lockdown restrictions starting to lift, we've needed wisdom in how we move forwards, and suddenly that's upon us. Our churches can be opened from this weekend, and there's so much to do. Please do look out for more details in our newsletter and social media posts as we long to be back worshipping together and serving together. And actually, it's this thought that's brought me to this series. As a family, we were watching a film about the book of Daniel, and like most films, they end up picking up on a thread or a theme, and they run with that. But what struck me most about the film was how Daniel and others lived their lives completely dedicated to God, and yet they're essentially imprisoned in a foreign land. They were exalted to Babylon from their own country, educated in their captors' ways and made to live as their captors did, but God was still with them, and God was going to make himself known to the rulers of Babylon. And Daniel and his friends, they didn't end up in a dungeon or a prison of war camp somewhere just rotting away. No, as we'll see over these next few weeks, they were actually elevated to positions of authority like Joseph was. They had massive influence over the entire land, even the kings, and yet they were outsiders and captives. Now, Daniel and his friends served 4 kings, and there are 4 lessons that we're going to take from each of those for ourselves. And while there are many things we could pick up in Daniel, I really want this series to be another great encouragement to us that will help us to live God-focused lives. His kingdom come and his will be done. Now, this is a direct follow-on from the last series, Pliancy, which also had practical impact on our lives. And it's really aimed to give us not one of those, whoa, I never knew that kind of messages or moments which leaves us feeling less able to do the things that God has called us to do. But I want us to hunger and thirst for more of the kind of Daniel relationship that he had with God, and to live lives which are expecting to hear from God and to demonstrate that supernatural power that only comes from God. And as a result, others will see that in us, and they cannot help but challenge themselves and ask themselves, how do I have that wonderful relationship with God too? So let's have a little bit of background to Daniel and how he came to be exiled. Then we'll sort of bullet point some key moments in the reign of this first king that Daniel served, and then we'll draw out a lesson at the end. So that's where we're heading this morning. So what happened historically? Well, a lot of you will know Jerusalem was conquered, and based upon historical events described in 1 and 21 in Daniel 1, you can see Daniel ministered from about 605 to 534 BC. Others say different times, but Daniel was alive at the same time as the prophets Jeremiah, Obadiah and Ezekiel. And God's critics have tried to disprove Daniel, saying it was written after the events to prove that there is no God. And even if they say, well, okay, there is possibly a God, he's actually not powerful enough to save his people or his city or his temple. But right at the beginning of Daniel 1:2, it is written that God himself gave Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, along with some of the articles from the temple, into Nebuchadnezzar's hands. You see, Jerusalem wasn't captured because God was weak, but God wanted to get the attention of his people again. John Calvin comments like this. He says, King Nebuchadnezzar did not possess Jerusalem as not the conqueror of the nation by his own valour or counsel or good luck, but because God wished to humble his people, as was the custom at the time. Some royals and young men were taken into captive, and among the young people taken were Daniel and his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael and Azariah. Now, it's understood they were probably selected because of their youth, aptitude, appearance, and therefore they would actually enter into training for a leadership position in the kingdom. Now, this was going to present some challenges, of course, for them. And there's that lovely phrase I like, how far do they go? Now their names were changed away from the God-reflected names with that El at the end of the name, at the end of their name, meaning the name of God, or Aya, that shorthand. So you got for Jehovah, which is Daniel, Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah. Those names were changed to pagan names and pagan deities' names. And some would suggest that they were probably about 11 to 14 years old when they were taken into captive. Some say they were older, but what we do know is the education at that time would have started around 14. So we can probably safely say they were teenagers. Now, what subjects would they have learnt? Well, they probably would have learnt a bit of astrology. They certainly would have learnt the study of animal entrails, very nice. The rites of purification, sacrifice, incantation, exorcism, and other forms of prophecy and magic. And while one can say, wow, these things are really dangerous, they shouldn't be dabbling with that. What I think is important to note is that what we read or study doesn't necessarily defile us. We can learn stuff, but actually eating the royal food was one step too far for them. And we'll pick this up in our lesson for today in just a moment. But I just want to pick up on some other key points about this first king in our story here, King Nebuchadnezzar. Now remember, he was wise and a great ruler. He was an empire builder. He wasn't an idiot. He did seek counsel from Daniel after Daniel and his friends interpreted his untold dream, which his own wise men and magicians couldn't do. The king built a huge statue about 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, we're told. And when Daniel's friends, you'll know their names well, now called Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, when they refused to bow down and worship this image, they were thrown into that fiery furnace, weren't they? But they survived. Now the king had a second dream, and after Daniel interpreted it, it's about 12 months later, we're told, it came true, and the king became like a wild animal, eating grass like an ox. But after a period of time, probably about 7 years or so, he looked to the heavens, blessed God, realizing everything that he does is right and all of God's ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he's able to humble. After that, the king is restored and he gives glory to Daniel's God. Now, there's a lot more you can read about in those first 4 chapters, and there's some great series online that you can dig into if you want to go into those details a lot more. But for this series, I want us to be able to draw a practical lesson from this first king that can really help us with everything that's going on today, particularly with this pandemic, lockdown, coming out of lockdown, opportunities to open our churches, things we should grasp, things we should drop. What can we learn today from the book of Daniel that's going to inspire us to be like him? Well, I quoted John Calvin a minute ago, and he says, King Nebuchadnezzar did not possess Jerusalem as not the conqueror of the nation by his own valour or counsel or good luck, but because God wished to humble his people. And I'd say of today, the coronavirus, the people behind it, the government, the right or the wrong decisions they've made were only allowed to happen because God what? Now, I'm not going to finish that sentence because I don't think we know the specific answer. But I'm certain that whatever the reason was, the outcome is that God wants to see souls saved. And of course, that's yours and my mission, isn't it? So what's the question that I could ask today? Well, how do we humble ourselves? How do we thrive in our current circumstances and still remain faithful to God and complete in his mission? How do we engage well with those that oppress us or oppose us? And how do we engage well at all if we're in lockdown? When do we actually say enough is enough? I won't go any further. But how do we do that without causing upset? Are you and I up for the challenge as Daniel was? Now, there is so much godly wisdom in those first few chapters of Daniel. And my aim is to draw them together now and point us to God so that we too can see how God is at work in our lives. Let us never fall into that trap of saying others have it easier than us. You might even look at Daniel, but hey, look, listen, Daniel was a teenager. He was taken captive, threatened with death if he didn't interpret an unknown dream. He would have lost his family and his home. He was living in a pagan culture which would have literally sickened him and his friends. And he was walking a tightrope on a daily basis. And he needed wisdom with how to engage with the king and his officials. Now we see this very early on in Daniel when Daniel says the royal food is one step too far. But how did he do that with wisdom? Well, one writer explained it like this. Daniel's way of collaborating with his overseer is a critical part of this story. It's a critical part. So listen to this. He says some Christians, when asked to do something against their consciences, they either just simply go along with it uncritically, or else they take that confrontational stand that appears to make them maybe holier than thou in the eyes of the world. Now, Daniel found a third path, recognizing that his boss was actually sympathetic, but was in a difficult position. If Daniel and his friends lost vigour due to the lower quality food, and in the eyes of the overseer, remember, vegetables and water just seemed inferior to the royal food of wine and so on, the overseer would not only just lose his job, but also lose his life. You can read that in Daniel 1:10. So Daniel asked for an evaluation. Give us 10 days. If we're not healthier than the others, then we'll relent and we'll follow your diet. Now, when Daniel and his friends came out of the test after 10 days healthier than the others, everyone was given Daniel's diet, no doubt leading to another workplace challenge between Daniel and the Babylonian students. So, to add to Daniel's list of struggles, now most of his peers probably wanted to kill him too, and will certainly have had an axe to grind to get rid of him later on. But here's the takeaway, the thought for us today from this first chapter in Daniel 1. You know, God is sovereign. He will raise whoever he pleases. You can read that in Daniel 1:2 or see that in 1:2. God put Daniel and his friends where God wanted them to be. And they found favour and compassion, as you just heard a moment ago, from the official in charge of them. You can read that in Daniel 1:9. God also allowed Daniel and his friends to exceed the physical and mental development of their peers, not just because of their knowledge and their better diet, but because actually God gave them knowledge and understanding and all kinds of literature and learning. You can read that in Daniel 17. God also, it says, gave more wisdom to Daniel's training by the king's professors. For in every matter of wisdom and understanding, concurring with the king, when he inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the whole of the kingdom. A quote from Daniel 1:20. You see, the pattern or the takeaway here is that God is powerful. He has power over kings and nations and their teaching and so-called wisdom. He has power over people and their pride, and he can humble even the most successful kings and rulers, and they will bow down and they will declare him as the sovereign Lord. And this is the God that you and I are made in the image of. And he too promises to fill us with Holy Spirit, that no matter where you and I are, we can serve him. But what can we do with God's power? Whether we feel we're in the wrong job or possibly the wrong college course or the wrong uni course now, whatever the teaching or the education we're receiving seems to be ungodly, or whether we work in a non-Christian or even hostile work environments, with a slight change of perspective and a complete trust in God, I believe everything changes. So what are the examples we can take from Daniel? Well, look, he prayed. Let's come back to it. He prayed 3 times a day. You can read that in 6:10. More so, he prayed through the hard times with fasting. It was prayer and fasting. And we'll pick up a little bit more on Daniel's prayer in chapter 9 in a few weeks' time. But look, just in closing today, nice short message for us. In closing today, the recap is this. God is able and God will have his ways. God can and will position people in positions of authority over us that may bring about all sorts of things we disagree with. But you and I can still demonstrate our love for God and be people of peace and rise to positions of authority if we're seen to be wise and peace-loving. Remember, nothing can stop us from praying or seeking after God's heart and God's wisdom. So my closing challenge is this. How have you and I reacted or interacted with people of power, authority and influence during our lockdown? Do you and I long for that wisdom that God gave to Daniel and his friends? What might we change or implement from the lessons from Daniel today? And look, I've raised lots of questions in this message, and I've done that this week on purpose. Firstly, so as individuals, you and I might have something to press into in our personal study times. But I know some want to gather in home groups, and therefore you might be able to meet up in your groups of 6 and discuss these thoughts further. If anyone wants question sheets, they will be made available. But my point is this morning. I want you and I to be able to understand what it means to have that relationship with God, that complete and utter wisdom, God at work in our lives, and how we engage with those around us. I spoke about being people of peace at the end of our pliancy message. I spoke about being able to say, or be able to use those words, anything's possible when we recognize God's power, Christ at work in us. So my prayer this morning is that you would take some of these, challenge yourself with some of those questions. How do we engage well? And where do we go from here as restrictions start to be lifted? May you know God's peace and grace and his wisdom, especially this day. God bless you.